The morning mist clung to the pine trees like secrets refusing to be told. 8 children had walked into Whispering Ridge State Forest on a crisp October day in 1994, their laughter echoing through the wilderness as they followed the well-marked Deer Creek Trail. By sunset, the forest had swallowed them whole. No screams, no distress calls, no trail of breadcrumbs leading back home. Just silence that stretched for 30 years until last month, when a metal detector enthusiast stumbled across something buried beneath the autumn leaves that changed everything. Before we dive deeper into what was found and why it's sending shockwaves through the investigation, hit that subscribe button, because stories like this one deserve to be remembered, and the families still searching for answers deserve our attention. The Whispering Ridge disappearance wasn't just another missing persons case. It became the kind of mystery that haunts small towns for generations, the kind that turns neighbors into amateur detectives and transforms quiet coffee shop conversations into heated debates about what really happened in those woods. 8 kids don't just vanish into thin air, especially not on a trail that park rangers described as practically impossible to get lost on. Let me paint you the picture of that day. October 15th, 1994. The Riverside Middle School Outdoor Adventure Club had organized what should have been a routine day hike. These weren't inexperienced kids wandering off into unknown territory. The club had been making this exact same trip every fall for 6 years without incident. The Deer Creek Trail was considered one of the safest in the entire state forest system, well maintained, clearly marked, with emergency call boxes positioned every half mile. The group consisted of 8 7th and 8th graders, all between the ages of 12 and 14. There was Sarah Mitchell, the natural leader who'd been hiking since she could walk. Her best friend Jessica Chen, quiet but observant, always the one to spot wildlife before anyone else. The twins, Marcus and Matthew Rodriguez, inseparable brothers who finished each other's sentences and shared an uncanny ability to navigate by instinct alone. Then you had David Thompson, the class comedian whose jokes kept everyone's spirits up, even on the steepest climbs. Ashley Brooks, the photographer who documented every adventure with her beloved disposable camera. Kevin Walsh, the bookworm who could identify every tree species and rock formation they encountered. And finally, there was Emma Patterson, the youngest of the group at barely 12 years old, but tough as nails and determined to keep up with the older kids. Leading this expedition was Mrs. Rebecca Harrison, a veteran teacher with 15 years of outdoor education experience. She'd guided hundreds of students through these same woods without so much as a scraped knee. Park records show she'd completed the required safety training just 2 months prior, and her emergency preparedness checklist was meticulous. Radio check every hour, mandatory buddy system, detailed itinerary filed with park headquarters, and a strict turnaround time of 4 p.m., regardless of how far they'd traveled. The morning started perfectly. Weather reports showed clear skies with temperatures in the comfortable mid-60s. The group assembled in the parking lot at 9 a.m. sharp. Everyone accounted for, gear checked, parents' permission slips verified. Mrs. Harrison conducted her standard safety briefing while the kids fidgeted with excitement, eager to hit the trail. By 9:30, they were officially underway. Here's where the timeline becomes crucial, because every detail matters when you're trying to understand how 8 people can simply disappear. The first radio check came at 10:30 a.m., right on schedule. Mrs. Harrison reported they were making good time, the kids were in high spirits, and they'd reached the first major landmark, a distinctive rock formation locals called Eagle's Perch. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. The second check at 11:30 painted the same picture. They'd covered another mile and were approaching the scenic overlook that offered panoramic views of the valley below. Mrs. Harrison mentioned that Ashley was having a field day with her camera, and the twins had spotted a family of deer in a meadow clearing. Normal chatter from a group enjoying a beautiful day in nature. But here's where things start to feel different. The noon radio check was brief, almost perfunctory. Mrs. Harrison's voice sounded slightly strained, though park rangers later said they didn't think much of it at the time. She simply confirmed their location. said they were taking a lunch break by Deer Creek itself, and that they'd be starting their return journey within the hour. The transmission was clear, no static, no indication of any equipment problems. That was the last anyone ever heard from them. When Mrs. Harrison failed to make the 1 p.m. check, park headquarters initially wasn't concerned. Radio dead zones existed throughout the forest, and it wasn't uncommon for groups to lose communication temporarily. But when 2 p.m. came and went with still no contact, rangers began paying closer attention. By 3 p.m., with their scheduled return time of 4 p.m. fast approaching, the first search team was dispatched. What they found at the lunch spot by Deer Creek has puzzled investigators for 3 decades. The scene was eerily pristine, almost staged in its normalcy. 9 backpacks were arranged in a neat circle around the remains of a small campfire. Lunch containers were stacked and organized, not scattered as you'd expect if there had been any kind of struggle or emergency. Personal items were accounted for: water bottles, trail maps, even Ashley's precious camera with half a roll of film still unused. But there were no people, no signs of distress, no indication of which direction they might have gone. The most unsettling detail was how methodical everything appeared. This wasn't the chaotic aftermath of panic or confusion. Someone had taken the time to clean up, to organize, to arrange things with careful precision before vanishing into the wilderness. The search effort that followed was unprecedented in state forest history. Within hours, over 200 volunteers had mobilized, including professional search and rescue teams, trained tracking dogs, and even military personnel from a nearby base. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept the canopy, while ground teams combed through every square foot of surrounding terrain. For 6 days, the search continued around the clock. They found deer trails and bear tracks, abandoned campsites from previous years, and plenty of false alarms that sent hearts racing, only to reveal nothing more than shadows and wishful thinking. What they didn't find was any trace of 9 human beings who had simply walked off the face of the earth. The dogs were perhaps the most puzzling aspect of those early search efforts. Bloodhounds brought in from 3 different agencies all exhibited the same strange behavior when they reached the lunch site. They would circle the area, whining and agitated, but couldn't pick up a scent trail leading away from the creek. It was as if the group had dissolved into the air itself, leaving behind no trace that trained animals could follow. By day 7, the official search was scaled back to a recovery operation. Hope was fading that they'd find anyone alive, but families refused to accept that 8 children and their teacher could simply disappear without explanation. Private search parties continued for months, sometimes years afterward, driven by desperate parents who couldn't let go of the possibility that their children were still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. The investigation that followed consumed resources from multiple law enforcement agencies. The FBI was called in within 48 hours, treating it as a potential kidnapping case. State police established a command center that remained active for nearly 2 years. Local deputies interviewed hundreds of people, from park employees to hikers, who'd been in the area that weekend. Every theory you could imagine was explored. Had they encountered a dangerous individual who forced them to leave the trail? The lunch site showed no signs of struggle, and 9 people don't go quietly without someone managing to signal for help. Had they gotten lost, despite the clearly marked trail? Search teams covered every possible route they could have taken, including areas that would have required technical climbing skills none of the children possessed. Could they have fallen into an undiscovered cave system? Geological surveys were conducted, but Whispering Ridge sits on bedrock that doesn't typically form the kind of caverns that could swallow an entire group. Had they been attacked by wildlife? Bears were present in the forest, but again, there would have been evidence, and park rangers confirmed that no dangerous animals had been reported in that area. The most disturbing theory was the one nobody wanted to voice, but everyone was thinking. Had someone been watching the group, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? The organized nature of the lunch site suggested planning, patience, and a level of control that made investigators' skin crawl. But who could overpower 9 people, including a trained adult, without leaving behind so much as a scuff mark in the dirt? As months turned into years, the case file grew thicker while the leads grew colder. Psychics offered their services. Conspiracy theorists spun elaborate tales involving everything from government cover-ups to alien abduction, and well-meaning but ultimately unhelpful tips poured in from across the country. Every Halloween brought renewed media attention. Every anniversary sparked fresh searches by volunteers who refused to let the mystery die. The families never stopped looking. Sarah Mitchell's parents spent their life savings hiring private investigators and funding search expeditions. Jessica Chen's mother became a missing persons advocate, helping other families navigate the nightmare of having a loved one disappear. The Rodriguez family moved away after 5 years, unable to bear living in a town where every street corner held memories of their lost sons. But small towns have long memories, and Whispering Ridge became a place that locals avoided after dark. Stories spread about strange lights seen deep in the forest, about voices calling out from empty trails, about hikers who reported feeling watched by invisible eyes. The Park Service noticed a significant decline in visitors, and eventually, the Deer Creek Trail was closed to the public, officially due to maintenance issues, but really because nobody wanted to be responsible if something similar happened again. For 30 years, the mystery of the Whispering Ridge 8 remained exactly that: a mystery without answers, a puzzle without solution, a wound that never quite healed for the families left behind. The case files gathered dust in storage rooms. The media moved on to fresher tragedies, and a new generation grew up barely aware that 8 children had once walked into those woods and never walked out. Until last month, when everything changed. Michael Brennan was the kind of guy who found treasure in other people's trash. A retired electrician with too much time on his hands and a metal detector that had become his closest companion, he'd spent the better part of 3 years combing through the abandoned sections of Whispering Ridge State Forest. Most days, he'd come home with nothing more than rusty bottle caps and the occasional lost wedding ring. But October 23rd wasn't most days. The detective's familiar beep had led him to a spot roughly 2 miles northeast of the old Deer Creek Trail, deep in an area that had been off-limits to the public since the disappearances. Brennan had special permission from the Forestry Service to search these restricted zones as part of a volunteer cleanup initiative. What he unearthed from beneath 18 inches of packed earth and decaying leaves would reignite a case that had been ice-cold for 3 decades. It was a metal lunchbox, the kind kids carried to school in the 1990s, faded and corroded, but still intact, with cartoon characters barely visible beneath layers of rust and grime. Inside, wrapped in what remained of a plastic bag, were items that made Brennan's hands shake as he realized what he'd found. 9 student ID cards from Riverside Middle School, dated 1994. Every single member of the missing group was represented, their young faces smiling out from laminated cards that should have been in backpacks at the bottom of Deer Creek, not buried miles away in unmarked forest. But that wasn't the most chilling discovery. Tucked beneath the ID cards was a folded piece of notebook paper, the kind with blue lines that every middle schooler used. The writing was barely legible after 30 years underground, but forensic experts were able to make out most of the message. If you're reading this, we're probably dead. The man said we had to come with him, or he'd hurt other kids. Mrs. Harrison tried to fight, but there were too many of them. We're being taken somewhere north. I'm leaving this hoping someone finds it. Tell our parents we love them. Sarah M. The discovery sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies that had long since moved on to other cases. FBI Special Agent Catherine Walsh, who had worked the original investigation as a junior agent fresh out of Quantico, found herself pulled back into a mystery that had haunted her entire career. Now, a seasoned investigator with 30 years of experience, she approached the new evidence with both excitement and dread. "This changes everything we thought we knew about that day," Agent Walsh explained, during a press conference held at the Riverside Community Center. We always suspected the organized nature of the lunch site indicated human involvement, but we had no proof. This note, if authenticated, confirms that the children were taken against their will by multiple perpetrators. The forensic analysis of the lunchbox and its contents took weeks to complete. Carbon dating confirmed the items had been buried for approximately 30 years, consistent with the timeline of the disappearances. Handwriting analysis matched the note to samples of Sarah Mitchell's schoolwork that her parents had preserved. Most significantly, soil analysis revealed that the lunchbox had been moved at least once since its initial burial, suggesting someone had returned to the site in the intervening years. But the location of the burial site raised more questions than it answered. The spot where Brennan made his discovery was not along any logical escape route from the Deer Creek Trail. To reach that area, the group would have had to traverse some of the most difficult terrain in the entire forest, including steep ravines and dense undergrowth that would have been nearly impossible to navigate with 8 frightened children in tow. Detective Raymond Foster, who had joined the original investigation as a young deputy and was now nearing retirement himself, studied topographical maps with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. Either these perpetrators knew this forest better than anyone realized, or they had transportation we never considered, he said, tracing possible routes with his finger. You don't just march 9 people through wilderness like that without leaving some kind of trail. The revelation prompted the largest search effort in the forest since 1994. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the area around the burial site. Cadaver dogs, far more advanced than their 1990s counterparts, swept through sections of woods that had never been properly searched. Drone technology allowed investigators to examine the forest canopy from angles that had been impossible during the original search. What they found painted a picture that was both more hopeful and more terrifying than anyone had imagined. 3 additional burial sites were discovered within a half-mile radius of Brennan's initial find. Each contained personal items that clearly belonged to the missing group. Marcus Rodriguez's distinctive compass, a keychain that belonged to David Thompson, and most heartbreakingly, Ashley Brooks's camera, with the roll of film still inside. When that film was finally developed, using specialized techniques designed for severely damaged negatives, it revealed the last images the children had taken before their disappearance. The final photos showed the group posing at various points along the trail, laughing and enjoying what should have been just another school adventure. But the very last image on the roll was different. It was blurry, taken in haste, showing what appeared to be several adult figures approaching through the trees. The angle suggested Ashley had snapped the picture quickly, possibly while trying to hide the camera. Even more disturbing was what the search teams didn't find. Despite 4 separate burial sites containing the children's possessions, there were no human remains, no bones, no clothing, no physical evidence that the children themselves had ever been in that area. It was as if someone had carefully collected their belongings and buried them like breadcrumbs, creating a false trail that led nowhere. The psychological profile of the perpetrators began to take shape as FBI behavioral analysts studied the evidence. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or passion. The systematic collection and burial of the children's possessions suggested someone with intimate knowledge of police investigation techniques. The choice of burial locations indicated familiarity with the forest that went beyond casual hiking experience. Most unsettling of all, the fact that someone had returned to move the lunchbox suggested the perpetrators had been monitoring the case, possibly even participating in the search efforts. We're looking at individuals who not only planned this abduction meticulously, but who have been actively managing the crime scene for 30 years, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, a criminal psychologist brought in to consult on the case. This level of organization and long-term thinking indicates we're dealing with people who have significant resources and possibly law enforcement or military training. The revelation that the perpetrators might have been hiding in plain sight for 3 decades sent ripples of paranoia through the small community of Riverside. Neighbors began looking at each other with suspicion. Volunteer searchers from the original investigation found themselves wondering if they had been working alongside the very people responsible for the disappearances. Sheriff Robert Martinez, who had been a rookie deputy in 1994, now found himself leading the most important case of his career. He established a new task force that included federal agents, state investigators, and forensic specialists from across the region. Every piece of evidence from the original investigation was re-examined using modern techniques. Every interview was reviewed, every tip reconsidered in light of the new discoveries. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing archived news footage from the original search effort, an FBI analyst noticed something that had been missed for 30 years. In the background of a local news report filmed on day 3 of the search, a man could be seen watching the organized search teams with what appeared to be binoculars. The figure was partially obscured by trees, but enhancement technology revealed enough detail to create a composite sketch. That sketch was circulated through law enforcement databases and missing persons networks across the country. Within weeks, tips began pouring in from other jurisdictions, reporting similar disappearances involving groups of children who had vanished without a trace. A pattern emerged that was both shocking and terrifying. At least 6 other incidents across 4 states bore striking similarities to the Whispering Ridge case. In Colorado, a scout troop had disappeared during a camping trip in 1987. In Montana, 5 children from a summer camp had vanished while on a nature walk in 1991. In Oregon, an entire family had gone missing while hiking in 1996. Each case had the same hallmarks: organized departure scenes, missing personal items later found buried in remote locations, and no trace of the victims themselves. The scope of what investigators were uncovering was staggering. This wasn't an isolated incident, but potentially part of a decades-long pattern of organized child abduction that had flown under the radar of law enforcement agencies across the western United States. The implications were horrifying. Somewhere out there, a network of perpetrators had been systematically targeting children in wilderness areas, using their intimate knowledge of remote terrain to commit crimes and dispose of evidence. Agent Walsh found herself coordinating with task forces in multiple states as the investigation expanded beyond anything she had imagined when Michael Brennan first called to report his discovery. The metal lunchbox that had seemed like such a promising breakthrough was now revealed to be just the tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper into the darkness than anyone had dared to consider. The weight of what they were uncovering hit the investigative team like a sledgehammer. Sarah Mitchell's parents, now in their 70s, sat in Agent Walsh's temporary command center, with tears streaming down their weathered faces as she explained the expanded scope of the investigation. For 30 years, they had clung to the hope that their daughter's disappearance was somehow unique, an isolated tragedy that could be explained and resolved. Now they were learning it might be part of something far more sinister. "You're telling us there are other families out there who've been living through the same nightmare we have?" Sarah's mother, Patricia Mitchell, asked through trembling lips. Her husband Robert sat beside her, his calloused hands gripping hers so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Agent Walsh chose her words carefully. "We're still connecting the dots, but yes, there appear to be other cases that share significant similarities with what happened to your daughter and her classmates." The revelation sparked a media frenzy, unlike anything the small town of Riverside had seen since the original disappearances. News vans lined Main Street, reporters knocked on doors at all hours, and every resident with even the slightest connection to the case found themselves thrust into an unwanted spotlight. The local diner became an impromptu headquarters for journalists, their laptops and recording equipment transforming the quiet breakfast spot into a buzzing nerve center of speculation and investigation. Detective Foster, now just months from retirement, found himself working 18-hour days as tips and leads poured in from across the country. His small office at the county sheriff's department had been transformed into a war room, with maps covering every available wall space and boxes of evidence files stacked floor to ceiling. "In 43 years of police work, I've never seen anything like this," Foster told his wife over a dinner that had grown cold while he studied crime scene photographs. "These people, whoever they are, they've been playing a long game that makes professional criminals look like amateurs." The psychological profile continued to evolve as more evidence surfaced. Dr. Amanda Foster worked closely with FBI behavioral analysts to piece together a picture of the perpetrators that was both fascinating and terrifying. They were looking at individuals with military or paramilitary training, people who understood surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques, and most disturbingly, people who had integrated themselves into the communities they were targeting. "This isn't some shadowy organization operating from a remote compound," Dr. Foster explained during a briefing with the expanded task force. "These are people who live among their victims' families, who participate in search efforts, who offer comfort and support while secretly orchestrating the very crimes they're helping to investigate." The breakthrough that would crack the case wide open came from an unexpected source. Janet Morrison, a retired park ranger who had worked at Whispering Ridge State Forest for over 30 years, approached investigators with information she had kept to herself since 1994. Morrison had been one of the first responders to the scene when Mrs. Harrison failed to make her radio check, and something had bothered her about that day for 3 decades. "I never said anything because I thought I was imagining things," Morrison explained, her voice barely above a whisper as she sat across from Agent Walsh in the same community center where press conferences had been held. "But I remember seeing tire tracks near the old fire road that runs parallel to Deer Creek Trail. Fresh tracks made by something big, a truck or maybe a van." Morrison's revelation sent investigators scrambling back to archived reports and crime scene photographs. The fire road she mentioned had been briefly examined during the original search, but attention had quickly focused on the main trail system where the children were last seen. Now, armed with new perspective and advanced forensic techniques, teams returned to that forgotten stretch of Forest Service road. What they found buried beneath 30 years of fallen leaves and undergrowth was a treasure trove of evidence that had somehow been overlooked during the original investigation. Tire impressions preserved in dried mud showed the distinct tread patterns of heavy-duty vehicles. Forensic casting revealed at least 3 different sets of tires, suggesting multiple vehicles had been present at the site around the time of the disappearances. More importantly, soil analysis detected trace amounts of diesel fuel and motor oil that carbon dating placed within the time frame of October 1994. Someone had indeed used this remote access road to transport vehicles into the forest, vehicles large enough to carry away 9 people without leaving obvious signs of their passage on the main trail system. The discovery prompted a complete re-evaluation of the timeline investigators had been working with for 30 years. Instead of a spontaneous abduction that somehow spirited 9 people away on foot through impossible terrain, they were now looking at a carefully orchestrated operation involving multiple vehicles and personnel who knew the Forest Service road system better than most park employees. Sheriff Martinez convened an emergency meeting of the expanded task force to discuss the implications of Morrison's information. Representatives from 6 different law enforcement agencies crowded into the Riverside Community Center's main hall, their laptops and case files transforming the space where local residents usually gathered for bingo nights and town meetings. "We need to completely reconstruct our understanding of October 15, 1994, Sheriff Martinez announced to the assembled investigators. "We're not dealing with opportunistic predators who happen to encounter a hiking group. We're looking at people who knew exactly where that group would be, when they would be there, and how to extract them without detection." FBI Special Agent Thomas Crawford, brought in to coordinate the multi-state investigation, presented findings that painted an even more disturbing picture. Analysis of the other similar cases across Colorado, Montana, and Oregon revealed that all had occurred near wilderness areas with extensive service road networks accessible only to authorized personnel or individuals with detailed knowledge of Forest Service operations. We're developing a profile of perpetrators who either work within the park service system or have extensive connections to people who do, Agent Crawford explained. They understand patrol schedules, radio protocols, and emergency response procedures well enough to exploit gaps in coverage. The investigation took on new urgency as behavioral analysts warned that the 30-year gap since the last known incident didn't necessarily mean the perpetrators had stopped operating. Child abduction networks often went dormant for extended periods, only to resurface when they felt secure that law enforcement attention had moved elsewhere. Dr. Foster presented a chilling analysis of the evidence patterns across all the connected cases. In every instance, we see the same methodical approach to evidence disposal and misdirection. Personal items buried in locations designed to suggest false narratives about what happened to the victims. This isn't just about concealing crimes. It's about actively manipulating investigations to protect a larger operation. The scope of what they were uncovering began to attract federal attention at the highest levels. The Department of Justice allocated additional resources to what was now being called Operation Lost Trail, a coordinated effort involving FBI field officers across 5 states. Specialized units that typically focused on organized crime and terrorism were reassigned to assist with an investigation that seemed to grow more complex with each new discovery. Meanwhile, the families of the Whispering Ridge 8 found themselves dealing with renewed media attention and painful questions they thought they'd put behind them decades ago. Jessica Chen's parents, who had moved to California shortly after their daughter's disappearance, flew back to Riverside for the first time in 25 years to meet with investigators. "We thought we'd made peace with never knowing what happened to Jess," her father, David Chen, told reporters gathered outside the sheriff's department. "Now we're learning that someone out there has known the truth all along, and that's almost harder to bear than the not knowing." The psychological toll on the surviving family members was immense. Emma Patterson's mother, Linda, had spent 3 decades in therapy, trying to process the loss of her youngest child. Now she found herself reliving that trauma, while simultaneously grappling with the possibility that Emma might still be alive somewhere, held captive by people who had managed to evade law enforcement for 30 years. "Part of me wants to hope," Linda Patterson confided to a victim services counselor, "but part of me thinks it might be easier if I knew for certain that she died quickly that day in the woods. The thought that she might have suffered for years, might still be suffering somewhere, that's unbearable." Agent Walsh, who had made the Whispering Ridge case a personal crusade throughout her career, found herself working around the clock as new evidence continued to surface. The metal lunchbox discovery had opened floodgates that seemed to reveal new horrors with each passing day. Crime scene technicians were now examining burial sites across 4 states, each one yielding personal items that belonged to children who had vanished without explanation. The pattern that emerged was as methodical as it was horrifying. The perpetrators would target groups of children in remote wilderness areas, typically during school-sponsored outdoor activities when adult supervision was limited. They would extract their victims using service roads that provided access to areas far from main trail systems, and they would systematically bury the victims' personal belongings in locations designed to misdirect investigation efforts while leaving no trace of the children themselves. "We're looking at what might be the most sophisticated child trafficking operation in American history," Agent Walsh briefed Justice Department officials during a secure video conference. "These people have been operating for at least 30 years, possibly longer, with a level of organization and tradecraft that rivals professional intelligence operations. The investigation's expansion brought with it resources that local law enforcement could never have imagined. Satellite imagery analysis revealed previously unnoticed patterns of vehicle movement in wilderness areas around the times of various disappearances. Advanced computer modeling helped investigators identify other potential sites where evidence might be buried, and psychological profiling suggested that the perpetrators might have been involved in legitimate wilderness education or emergency response work, giving them both access to potential victims and the skills needed to move through remote terrain undetected. But with each new discovery came the crushing realization that they were potentially dealing with dozens of missing children across multiple decades. The scope of the crimes was staggering, and the possibility that some victims might still be alive somewhere added urgency to an investigation that was already consuming enormous resources. Detective Foster, despite his approaching retirement, threw himself into the expanded investigation with renewed energy. The case that had haunted his entire career was finally yielding answers, even if those answers were more disturbing than anything he had imagined when he first arrived at the Deer Creek Trail lunch site 30 years ago. These people destroyed entire families, Foster told his partner during one of their late-night evidence review sessions. They didn't just take children, they took away parents' ability to grieve properly, to find closure, to move on with their lives. That's not just kidnapping, that's a special kind of evil. As winter approached, the investigation showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, the pace was accelerating as new evidence continued to surface and connections between previously unrelated cases became clear. The small town of Riverside had become the epicenter of what was shaping up to be one of the largest missing persons investigations in U.S. history. The families of the Whispering Ridge 8 found themselves at the center of a storm they had never asked for but couldn't escape. Media attention brought both support and unwanted scrutiny. Well-meaning strangers reached out with tips and theories that usually led nowhere. And through it all, the central question remained unanswered. After 30 years of carefully concealed crimes, were any of the missing children still alive? Agent Walsh stared at the evidence board that now covered an entire wall of the Riverside Community Center's main hall. Red string-connected photographs, maps, and timeline markers in a web so complex it resembled something from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. But this wasn't theory anymore. This was cold, methodical fact, documented across decades of meticulous planning and execution. The latest breakthrough had come from an unlikely source. Margaret Thornfield, a retired librarian from the town of Cedar Falls, Montana, had contacted the FBI hotline after seeing news coverage of the Whispering Ridge investigation. She remembered something that had bothered her for 27 years, something about the summer camp disappearances that had occurred just 40 miles from her hometown. "I was volunteering at the Search Command Center," Thornfield explained, over a crackling phone connection to Agent Crawford's team. "There was this man who kept showing up every day, offering to help coordinate search grids. He seemed to know the terrain better than anyone, even the local park rangers. But something about him felt wrong. He was too interested in which areas had already been searched, too focused on making sure certain sectors were marked as cleared." Thornfield's description matched a pattern investigators were beginning to recognize across all the connected cases. In every instance, local residents remembered helpful volunteers who had inserted themselves into search efforts with unusual knowledge of the terrain and an almost obsessive interest in the investigation's progress. These weren't random Good Samaritans, Dr. Foster explained during a task force briefing. These were the perpetrators themselves, monitoring their own crime scenes, ensuring that investigations stayed on the wrong track while appearing to be concerned community members. The psychological profile continued to evolve as more witnesses came forward with similar stories. The perpetrators weren't hiding from law enforcement. They were hiding in plain sight, using their apparent cooperation to deflect suspicion while gathering intelligence about investigation strategies and potential breakthroughs. Detective Foster found himself reviewing 30-year-old witness statements with fresh eyes, looking for mentions of overly helpful volunteers or individuals who had seemed unusually knowledgeable about Forest Service operations. What he discovered sent chills down his spine. In the original Whispering Ridge investigation files, no fewer than 6 different search volunteers had been noted by various officers for their exceptional knowledge of the Forest Service road system. These individuals had guided search teams to remote areas, suggested alternative routes that might have been overlooked, and generally positioned themselves as indispensable resources for the investigation. We weren't just dealing with witnesses, Foster realized as he cross-referenced names and descriptions from the old reports. We were dealing with suspects who volunteered to help us find their own victims. The revelation prompted a complete review of volunteer records from all the connected cases. What emerged was a network of individuals who had appeared at multiple disappearance sites across different states, sometimes using different names, but always displaying the same pattern of behavior: exceptional wilderness knowledge, intense interest in search protocols, and a tendency to guide investigations away from certain areas. Agent Walsh coordinated with field officers across the region to track down surviving search volunteers and re-interview them about their experiences. Many had moved away or passed away in the intervening decades, but those who could be located provided disturbing accounts of interactions they had dismissed at the time as merely odd. There was this guy, called himself Jake Morrison, recalled former search team coordinator Bill Henderson from the Montana case. He showed up on day 2 with his own radio equipment and detailed topographical maps marked with notes about terrain conditions. Said he'd been hiking those mountains for 20 years. But looking back, it was weird how he always seemed to know exactly which areas would be too dangerous for search teams to access. Similar accounts emerged from other cases. Volunteers who appeared with professional-grade equipment and insider knowledge of Forest Service procedures. Individuals who seemed to anticipate which search strategies would be employed before they were announced. People who guided teams away from certain sectors while providing reasonable-sounding explanations about terrain difficulties or safety concerns. The pattern suggested a level of organization that went far beyond what investigators had initially imagined. This wasn't just a group of criminals operating in wilderness areas. This was a network that had infiltrated the very systems designed to find missing persons, using their positions to actively sabotage search efforts while maintaining the appearance of helpful cooperation. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Rebecca Martinez joined the task force to help profile what was emerging as one of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in modern American history. Her preliminary assessment painted a picture of perpetrators who understood law enforcement psychology, as well as they understood wilderness survival. They're not just avoiding detection, Dr. Martinez explained. They're actively managing detection. They insert themselves into investigations to control the flow of information, misdirect resources, and ensure that evidence is interpreted in ways that serve their interests rather than revealing the truth. The scope of the network's influence became clearer as investigators dug deeper into the backgrounds of suspicious volunteers. Several had connections to military or law enforcement training. Others had worked in emergency services or search and rescue operations. A few had been employed by park services or forest management agencies at various points in their careers. We're looking at people who didn't just stumble into this operation, Agent Crawford briefed his superiors. These are individuals who specifically positioned themselves in careers and volunteer roles that would give them access to potential victims and the ability to influence investigations when crimes occurred. The investigation's expansion brought unwelcome attention to communities across the western United States that had experienced similar disappearances. Local law enforcement agencies found themselves overwhelmed with media requests and citizen tips about suspicious individuals who might be connected to the network. In Riverside, the constant presence of federal agents and news crews was taking a toll on residents who had spent 30 years trying to move past the tragedy that had defined their town. Main Street businesses struggled to operate normally with satellite trucks parked outside and reporters conducting interviews on every corner. This town has been carrying the weight of those missing children for 3 decades, Mayor Christine Valdez told a packed town hall meeting. Now we're learning that the people responsible might have been living among us all along, attending our church services and shopping in our stores while we mourned the children they took. The psychological impact on the community was profound. Neighbors who had known each other for decades began viewing one another with suspicion. Long-time residents wondered if helpful volunteers from the original search effort might have been the very people responsible for the disappearances. Sheriff Martinez found himself fielding dozens of calls each day from citizens reporting suspicious behavior by individuals who had seemed perfectly normal for years. Most of the tips led nowhere, but the paranoia was understandable, given what the investigation was revealing about the network's ability to blend into local communities. The families of the missing children faced their own psychological challenges as the investigation's scope became clear. For 30 years, they had grieved their lost children while maintaining hope that answers would eventually emerge. Now they were learning that those answers had been deliberately concealed by people who had pretended to share their pain and support their search efforts. Patricia and Robert Mitchell found themselves re-examining every interaction they'd had with search volunteers and community supporters over the years. Had any of the people who had offered comfort and assistance been involved in their daughter's disappearance? The possibility was almost too horrifying to contemplate. "We invited some of those volunteers into our home," Patricia told Agent Walsh during one of their regular update meetings. "They sat at our kitchen table and held my hand while I cried about Sarah. To think that some of them might have been responsible for her disappearance, have known exactly what happened to her. It makes me physically sick." The investigation took another dramatic turn when forensic accountants examining financial records from the various connected cases discovered a pattern of unusual monetary transactions. In each location where disappearances had occurred, significant cash deposits had been made to accounts belonging to individuals who had volunteered for search efforts. Agent Walsh coordinated with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division to trace the sources of these payments. What they found was a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts that had been funneling money to operatives across multiple states for at least 25 years. "We're not just dealing with a kidnapping ring," Agent Walsh briefed Justice Department officials. "We're looking at what appears to be a highly sophisticated trafficking operation with international connections and serious financial backing." The revelation that the network had substantial funding sources transformed the investigation from a regional missing persons case into a matter of national security. Federal agencies that typically focused on organized crime and international terrorism were brought in to help trace the money trail and identify the network's leadership structure. Meanwhile, advances in forensic technology were yielding new insights from evidence that had been collected decades earlier. DNA analysis of trace materials found at burial sites revealed genetic markers from multiple individuals who weren't connected to any of the missing children. These unknown DNA profiles were entered into federal databases and cross-referenced with samples from convicted criminals and military personnel. The first match came from an unexpected source. One of the DNA profiles found at the Oregon burial site matched a sample in the military database belonging to Thomas Bradley Carpenter, a former Army Ranger who had been dishonorably discharged in 1983 for conduct violations that had been classified and sealed. Agent Crawford's team located Carpenter working as a wilderness guide in northern Idaho, operating a legitimate business that took tourists on backcountry expeditions. He had lived in the area for over 20 years, was well respected in the community, and had even volunteered for several search and rescue operations involving missing hikers. "The perfect cover," Dr. Martinez observed when reviewing Carpenter's background. "He's positioned himself as someone who knows wilderness areas better than anyone, someone who could explain away his presence in remote locations and his knowledge of terrain that most people would never access." The arrest of Thomas Carpenter marked the first major breakthrough in the active investigation phase of Operation Lost Trail. Under interrogation, he initially denied any involvement in the disappearances, but gradually began revealing details about the network's operations as federal prosecutors outlined the charges he was facing. "There are others," Carpenter finally admitted during his third day of questioning. "People in positions you'd never suspect, people who've been protecting this operation for longer than you can imagine." Carpenter's cooperation led to the identification of two additional suspects: Maria Elena Santos, a former Park Service employee who had worked at multiple locations where disappearances occurred, and Dr. William Henley, a child psychologist who had counseled families of missing children while allegedly being involved in their disappearances. The arrests sent shockwaves through the communities where these individuals had lived and worked for years. Santos had been considered a model employee during her 15-year career with the National Park Service. Henley had built a reputation as a compassionate advocate for families dealing with missing persons cases. These people didn't just hide among us, Sheriff Martinez told reporters gathered outside the Riverside courthouse. They inserted themselves into positions where they could actively participate in the aftermath of their own crimes, offering comfort to grieving families while protecting their network from detection. As news of the arrests spread, additional witnesses began coming forward with information about suspicious interactions they had had with the suspects over the years. A pattern emerged of individuals who had shown unusual interest in children's outdoor activities, who had positioned themselves to gather information about school trips and family camping plans. The investigation was far from over. Carpenter's admissions had revealed that the network included members they hadn't yet identified, individuals who might still be operating in communities across the western United States. The scope of the crimes was larger than anyone had initially imagined, potentially involving dozens of missing children and a support structure that had protected the operation for decades. Agent Walsh found herself coordinating with international law enforcement agencies as evidence suggested the network's activities extended beyond U.S. borders. Financial transactions had been traced to accounts in several countries known for their banking secrecy laws, and some of the missing children might have been transported across international boundaries. The families of the Whispering Ridge 8 faced the agonizing possibility that their children might still be alive somewhere, held captive in conditions they could barely imagine. After 30 years of grieving, they now had to confront the hope that their loved ones might be recovered, while simultaneously preparing for the reality that rescue might come too late. "I don't know what's worse," confided David Chen, Jessica's father, thinking she died quickly in those woods 30 years ago, or imagining that she's been suffering all this time while we went on with our lives. The investigation had revealed the existence of a criminal network more sophisticated and long-lasting than any law enforcement agency had encountered in a missing persons case. But it had also provided the first real hope in 3 decades that some of the missing children might still be found alive. As winter deepened around Riverside, the small town that had become the epicenter of one of the largest criminal investigations in American history braced itself for whatever revelations were still to come. The metal lunchbox that Michael Brennan had unearthed with his metal detector had opened a door that could never be closed again, revealing truths that were both more horrifying and more hopeful than anyone had dared to imagine. The search for the Whispering Ridge 8 was no longer just about finding answers to a 30-year-old mystery. It had become a race against time to locate and rescue victims who might still be waiting for someone to find them. Victims whose families had never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would come home. The breakthrough came at 2:47 a.m. on a frigid December morning when Agent Crawford's phone rang with news that would change everything. Thomas Carpenter had finally cracked under the pressure of federal charges and isolation from his network. After weeks of careful psychological pressure and strategic revelation of evidence, he was ready to talk about locations where victims might still be held. "There's a compound in northern Wyoming," Carpenter whispered across the metal table in the federal detention facility. His voice was hoarse from days of interrogation, his hands trembling as he sketched rough maps on yellow legal paper. "They call it the Sanctuary. Kids who were too young to remember their real names, they keep them there, train them for different purposes." Agent Walsh felt her stomach drop as she listened to Carpenter's confession through the secure video link from Riverside. The implications of what he was describing went beyond anything the task force had prepared for. This wasn't just about solving historical disappearances. They were potentially looking at active captivity situations involving victims who had been held for decades. How many children are we talking about? Agent Crawford pressed, his voice steady, despite the horror of what he was hearing. Carpenter's eyes darted around the room, as if his handlers might materialize from the shadows. I don't know exactly. Maybe 20, maybe 30. Some from cases you don't even know about yet. They move them around between different sites depending on age and training progress. The revelation prompted an immediate escalation to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Within hours, FBI Director Catherine Morrison was briefing the Attorney General on Operation Lost Trails evolution from a cold case investigation into an active hostage rescue scenario. Tactical teams from multiple agencies were placed on standby as intelligence analysts worked to verify Carpenter's information and locate the compound he described. Dr. Rebecca Martinez found herself consulting on psychological preparation strategies for potential victims who might have been in captivity since childhood. The challenges were unprecedented in American law enforcement history. How do you rehabilitate individuals who might not remember their real names or families? How do you reintegrate people who had been deliberately isolated from normal society for decades? We're potentially looking at victims who have been subjected to systematic psychological conditioning for most of their lives, Dr. Martinez explained to the expanded task force. Some may not even realize they're victims. The network appears to have used sophisticated techniques to create false memories and artificial loyalty structures. Meanwhile, in Riverside, the families of the missing children struggled to process the possibility that their loved ones might actually be alive after 3 decades. Patricia Mitchell found herself unable to sleep, staring at 30-year-old photographs of Sarah and wondering what her daughter might look like now, how the years of captivity might have changed her. Part of me is terrified to hope, Patricia confided to the victim services counselor assigned to support the families. What if Sarah is alive but doesn't remember us? What if she's been programmed to see us as strangers or even enemies? The psychological preparation extended beyond the immediate families to the entire community of Riverside. Mayor Christine Valdez worked with federal authorities to establish protocols for media management and community support if active rescues were conducted. The small town had become the focal point of international attention, and successful operations could bring even more intense scrutiny. Agent Walsh coordinated with satellite surveillance teams to identify potential compound locations in the remote wilderness areas of northern Wyoming. The terrain was challenging, with limited access roads and weather conditions that made reconnaissance difficult. If Carpenter's information was accurate, the perpetrators had chosen their location with the same careful planning that had characterized all their operations. They're not just hiding from law enforcement, observed FBI tactical specialist Agent David Kowalski during planning sessions. They've positioned themselves in an area where any approach would be visible for miles, where winter conditions could cut them off from outside interference for months at a time. The first concrete evidence of the compound's existence came from thermal imaging satellites that detected heat signatures consistent with human habitation in an area that should have been uninhabited wilderness. The signatures suggested a substantial facility with multiple buildings and what appeared to be underground construction that would be invisible to casual aerial observation. Thomas Carpenter's cooperation intensified as federal prosecutors offered him plea arrangements in exchange for detailed intelligence about the compound's layout and security measures. His descriptions painted a picture of a facility that had been constructed over many years with meticulous attention to defensibility and concealment. They've got early warning systems positioned miles out from the main compound, Carpenter explained, his sketches becoming more detailed as his memory was prompted by specific questions. Motion sensors, cameras, even seismic detectors that can pick up vehicle approaches from different directions. The security measures suggested that any rescue operation would need to be planned with military precision. The perpetrators had clearly anticipated the possibility of law enforcement intervention and had prepared accordingly. Agent Kowalski's tactical team began developing assault scenarios that would minimize risk to potential hostages while neutralizing threats from defenders. Dr. Martinez worked with child psychology specialists to prepare for the complex rehabilitation needs of potential survivors. The psychological profiles suggested they might encounter individuals who had been conditioned to fear law enforcement, who might resist rescue attempts, or who might not understand that they were being freed rather than attacked. "We need to be prepared for victims who may try to protect their captors," Dr. Martinez warned the tactical team. Stockholm Syndrome in extended captivity situations can create powerful psychological bonds that override rational understanding of the situation. The investigation took another dramatic turn when financial analysts tracing the network's funding sources uncovered connections to international trafficking organizations with operations spanning multiple continents. The Wyoming compound appeared to be just one node in a much larger network that had been operating under law enforcement radar for decades. Agent Walsh found herself briefing Interpol and federal agencies from several allied nations as evidence suggested that some victims might have been transported internationally. The scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering, potentially involving hundreds of missing persons cases that had never been connected. "We're looking at what might be the largest human trafficking network ever uncovered," Agent Walsh reported to Justice Department officials during a secure video conference. "The financial infrastructure alone suggests operations generating tens of millions of dollars annually." The international connections added layers of complexity to rescue planning. If the network had the resources and connections that financial analysis suggested, they might have escape routes and backup facilities that could be activated if their primary location was compromised. Thomas Carpenter provided additional intelligence about the network's structure and leadership. According to his testimony, the operation was controlled by a small group of individuals who had military and intelligence backgrounds, people who understood operational security and had the skills to maintain a criminal enterprise over multiple decades. "The man they call the director, he's the one who started all this back in the 80s, Carpenter revealed during one of his extended debriefing sessions. "Former military intelligence, maybe CIA. He's got connections that go way up the chain in government and private sector." The revelation that the network might have protection from individuals in positions of authority sent shockwaves through the task force. If Carpenter was telling the truth, Operation Lost Trail wasn't just investigating a criminal organization. They were potentially exposing a conspiracy that included corrupt officials who had actively protected the network's operations. FBI Director Morrison convened emergency meetings with representatives from multiple agencies to assess the security implications of Carpenter's claims. The possibility that the network had been receiving inside information about law enforcement activities could explain how they had managed to avoid detection for so many years. "We need to assume that everything we're planning could be compromised," Director Morrison warned the operational commanders. "From this point forward, all tactical planning will be conducted on a need-to-know basis with enhanced security protocols." Meanwhile, advances in forensic technology were yielding additional insights from evidence collected at the various burial sites. DNA analysis had identified genetic material from at least 12 different individuals who weren't connected to any of the known missing children, suggesting that the network's activities had been even more extensive than initially realized. Agent Crawford's team worked with missing persons databases to try to match the unknown DNA profiles with cases from across the country. The results painted a horrifying picture of a criminal enterprise that had been systematically targeting children for at least 40 years, possibly longer. "We're finding connections to unsolved disappearances going back to the 1970s, Agent Crawford reported. "This network has been operating for at least 2 generations, possibly passing leadership and operational knowledge down through family or ideological connections." The scope of the investigation continued to expand as new evidence surfaced and additional witnesses came forward. Communities across the western United States found themselves re-examining decades-old missing persons cases, looking for connections to the network that had hidden in plain sight for so long. In Riverside, Detective Foster worked around the clock to coordinate with agencies investigating related cases. His small office had become a clearinghouse for information flowing in from multiple states, as the full extent of the network's activities became clear. 43 years I've been doing this job, Foster told his wife during one of their increasingly rare dinners together. I thought I'd seen every kind of evil people could do to each other. But this is something else entirely. These people didn't just commit crimes. They built an entire shadow world dedicated to destroying families. The families of the Whispering Ridge 8 found themselves at the center of an investigation that had grown far beyond anything they could have imagined. Media attention was intense, with reporters from around the world seeking interviews and updates about the potential rescue operations. Patricia and Robert Mitchell struggled to maintain their privacy while dealing with the possibility that their daughter might be found alive after 30 years. The hope was almost more difficult to bear than the grief had been, especially given the uncertainty about what condition Sarah might be in after decades of captivity. "We don't even know if she'll recognize us," Patricia confided to Agent Walsh during one of their regular briefings. 30 years is longer than she was alive when she disappeared. We're strangers to her now, even if she is found. The psychological challenges facing the families were compounded by the media circus surrounding the investigation. Well-meaning but intrusive reporters sought interviews, documentary filmmakers requested access, and online conspiracy theorists spun increasingly elaborate theories about the network's activities and connections. Mayor Valdez worked with federal authorities to establish media protocols that would protect the family's privacy while keeping the public informed about the investigation's progress. The balance was delicate, especially given the international attention the case was receiving. Dr. Martinez continued her work preparing for potential victim rehabilitation, consulting with specialists who had experience with cult deprogramming and extended captivity cases. The psychological challenges would be unprecedented, requiring resources and expertise that went far beyond traditional missing persons recovery. We're potentially looking at individuals who have been subjected to systematic brainwashing and conditioning for most of their lives, Dr. Martinez explained to rehabilitation specialists. Their entire understanding of reality may have been shaped by their captors. Reintegration could take years, if it's possible at all. The investigation's expansion brought attention from academic researchers studying organized crime and human trafficking. The network's sophistication and longevity made it a unique case study in how criminal organizations could operate under law enforcement radar for extended periods. Dr. Amanda Foster, from the University of Virginia's Criminology Department, joined the task force as a consultant, bringing expertise in organizational psychology and criminal network analysis. Her preliminary assessment suggested that the network had characteristics typically associated with terrorist organizations, rather than traditional criminal enterprises. They've created an ideological framework that justifies their activities and maintains operational security over multiple decades, Dr. Foster explained. This isn't just about profit, it's about people who believe they're serving a higher purpose that justifies any means necessary. The ideological component added another layer of complexity to rescue planning. If the network members were true believers rather than simple criminals, they might be willing to take extreme measures to protect their operation, including actions that could endanger hostages. Agent Kowalski's tactical team adjusted their planning to account for the possibility that compound defenders might choose to fight to the death rather than surrender. The presence of long-term captives, some potentially suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, meant that any rescue operation would need to be executed with extraordinary precision. "We're not just dealing with hostage takers," Agent Kowalski briefed his team. "We're potentially facing people who view themselves as protectors of a sacred mission. That makes them unpredictable and extremely dangerous." As winter deepened in Wyoming, weather conditions began affecting surveillance and reconnaissance efforts. The compound's remote location made it accessible only by snowmobile or helicopter during the winter months, factors that would complicate any rescue operation, but also potentially trap the perpetrators if they decided to flee. The metal lunchbox that Michael Brennan pulled from the forest floor that October morning did more than solve a 30-year-old mystery. It ripped open a wound that had never properly healed and revealed truths more horrifying than anyone in Riverside could have imagined. What started as 8 children disappearing on a school hike became the key to uncovering one of the most sophisticated criminal networks in American history. As federal agents prepare for what could be the largest hostage rescue operation on U.S. soil, the families who never stopped hoping face an agonizing wait. Somewhere in the Wyoming wilderness, their children may still be alive, forever changed by decades of captivity, but finally within reach of freedom. The investigation that began with buried ID cards and a desperate note has become a race against time to bring home victims who should have returned from their hike 30 years ago. If this story has taught us anything, it's that some secrets refuse to stay buried forever, and sometimes the answers we've waited our entire lives to hear are more devastating than the silence ever was.